Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. There's even a brand new Brigadier General tier where you can get a shout out on a Commander's Quarters episode that's dedicated to you. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in for the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So today's episode comes to you courtesy of Carl, who's been supported this channel as a General tier patron. I truly couldn't do this without the support from amazing patrons like Carl, so again, Carl, thank you so much. And actually, for the personalized deck tech, Carl's gonna handle the intro for me.
Hey Mitch, this is Carl from North Carolina. For my deck tech, I would like to see you build around Minsc, beloved ranger, focusing on an aristocrat strategy, using his ability as a free sack outlet to abuse death triggers and overwhelm opponents with value.
So, like Carl said, today's deck tech's gonna be built around Minsc, beloved ranger. Minsc is a 3/3 human ranger that costs red, green, white. When he enters the battlefield, we create Boo, a legendary 1/1 red hamster creature token with trample and haste. On top of that, by paying X until end of turn, target creature we control has base power and toughness XX and becomes a giant addition to other types, activate only as a sorcery. So, like Carl said, we can utilize that ability to actually sacrifice our creatures freely. By paying 0 mana into that X until the end of the turn, target creature we control becomes a 0/0 giant, so yeah, they die. Now, we may only be able to activate this at sorcery speed, but still, this is a free sacrifice outlet in our command zone, and there are a ton of powerful things that we can do with that. There are plenty of cards out there that benefit us when our creatures die, and there's even creatures out there that benefit us when they die as well. So we're going to get a ton of value by sacrificing our creatures in this aristocrat-style strategy. Also, for this deck, I decided to put a fun budget restriction on it. Every single card outside the commander is less than $1. So what cards are we going to be utilizing with this deck, and how exactly does it work? Well, let's jump into it to find out. So first up, let's talk about some turn 1 ramp spells that can get us ahead with things like Search for Tomorrow, Fond Fertility, and Diligent Farmhand. Search for Tomorrow is going to get us 1 basic into play untapped, and it's got Suspend 2 for a green, so yeah, suspending on the first turn is a fantastic play. And then Fond Fertility is basically a Wayfarer's Bauble as an enchantment. We can pay 1 and a green to sack it to get a basic land into play tapped. We can also do the exact same thing with Diligent Farmhand, but again, keep in mind that this is a creature, so we can get a lot of value out of this, and we'll talk about those value-producing sources later. Next up, we've got some creatures that can help us with some temporary ramp with things like Blister Pod, Impulsive Pilferer, and Gleaming Barrier. Blister Pod has, when it dies, we get a 1/1 Colorless Eldrazi sign creature token onto the battlefield. It has sacrificed this creature, add colors to your mana pool. So yeah, 2 bodies in 1 is a ton of value for just 1 mana, and again, we basically get that mana back. And speaking of getting that mana back, Impulsive Pilferer is a 1/1 for just a red, and when it dies, we get a treasure token, and on top of that, it's got Encore for 3 and a red. And then at 2 mana, Gleaming Barrier also creates us a treasure when it dies, and it's not quite as efficient, but it can still be a fantastic blocker for us, especially early on in the game. But then there's Veteran Explorer, which actually helps ramp all players. It says when it dies, each player may search the library for up to 2 basic land cards and put them onto the battlefield. Keep in mind that those come into play untapped, so yeah, in this deck, for 1 mana, we can basically ramp and get access to more mana in that turn by playing this and sacrificing it with our commander. And then there's Viridian Emissary and Primal Druid, which each do the exact same thing. When they die, we get a basic land into play tapped. And finally, we've got 2 more 2-mana ramp spells with Rampant Growth and Explore. Rampant Growth is going to get us 1 basic into play tapped, and Explore lets us play an additional land and it draws us a card. Now, I've already highlighted some creatures that can help ramp us, but we've also some other creatures that give us other benefits when they die. So first up, let's talk about some extremely low-to-the-ground inefficient creatures that replace themselves when they die with Grim Initiate, Tukatung Thalat, and Doom Traveler. When Grim Initiate dies, we amass 1. When Tukatung Thalat dies, we get a 1/1 Sapperling, and when Doom Traveler dies, we get a 1/1 Spirit with Flying. Again, the additional benefit of flying is nice, but the main thing is that these 1-mana creatures literally replace themselves. So again, when we sacrifice them with our commander, we get some death benefits from other sources, which again, as I mentioned before, we'll get to here in a bit, but then we get another creature that we can sacrifice again. And of course, we're nowhere near done yet with these creatures that die and make us a token, so let's talk about Hunted Witness, Garrison Cat, and Martyr of Dusk. Hunted Witness gives us a soldier with lifelink, Garrison Cat gives us a human soldier, and Martyr of Dust gives us a vampire with lifelink. Again, lifelink is a nice additional benefit, but the more important thing is just having bodies on the field. So next up, we've got some more 2-mana creatures that replace themselves with Beskir Shieldmate, Mirror Sire, and Dripping Tongue Zubara. When it dies, Beskir Shieldmate makes us a 1/1 human warrior, Mirror Sire makes us a 1/1 mirror, and Dripping Tongue Zubara gives us a 1/1 spirit. But then at 2 mana, we've got Brindle Shout, a boar that makes us a 3/3 boar when it dies. And when it comes to efficiency, it's really hard to beat Mogwar Marshal, which has, when it enters the battlefield or dies, you get a 1/1 red goblin creature token, and it's got an echo cost for 1 and a red. So even if we're not sacrificing this with our commander, we're still going to sacrifice it just by not paying that echo cost. And then Symbiotic Elf is also 3 bodies in 1, because when it dies, we get 2 1/1 insects. Speaking of which, we've also got Mausoleum Guard, which is going to make us 2 1/1 white spear creature tokens with flying when it dies. And how about Conclave Cavalier, a 4/4 with vigilance that has, when it dies, we get 2 2/2s with vigilance. And the final card in this section that I want to highlight isn't actually a creature unlike all the other ones, but it can still make us a lot of creature tokens. Promise of Bunray is an enchantment that says, when a creature you control dies, sacrifice it. If you do, create 4 1/1 Coast Spear creature tokens. So 3 mana for 4 creatures, yeah, that's a pretty good rate. Regardless, of course, we've got ways to make even more tokens and to get even more value out of these creatures that we're sacrificing. So first up, let's talk about Anax Hardened in the Forge. Anax has, whenever it or another non-token creature we control dies, we create a 1/1 Satyr creature token with. This creature can't block. If the creature had power 4 or greater, create 2 of those tokens instead. Now, typically we're not going to be getting 2 tokens because, again, our commander is all about making our creatures into 0/0s. But still, giving us a creature token every single time one of our creatures dies is huge. Or should I specify non-token creatures, because obviously that could just go infinite if not. Next up though, there's Requiem Angel, which is an absolute powerhouse in this deck. She has, whenever another non-spirit creature you control dies, put a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying onto the battlefield. This deck has a ton of non-spirits, including a lot of non-spirit creature tokens. So in that case, even by sacrificing tokens, we can still get even more creature tokens with this. But then there's Gutter Grime, which is effective in a different way. It's an enchantment that says, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, put a slime counter on Gutter Grime, then put a green ooze creature token onto the battlefield with. This creature's power and toughness are equal to the number of slime counters on Gutter Grime. So, like Anax, this only counts non-token creatures dying. But still, this can make some incredibly powerful oozes in absolutely no time. By sacrificing a ton of non-token creatures with this in play, we can get a lot of slime counters on this and create some massive oozes. But next up, let's talk about an artifact that can help us out as well with Lightning Coils. It says, whenever a non-token creature you control is put into a graveyard from play, put a charge counter on Lightning Coils. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if Lightning Coils has 5 or more charge counters on it, remove all of them and put that many 3/1 elemental creature tokens with haste into play. Exile them at the end of the turn. So this can essentially temporarily replace all the non-token creatures that we had die recently. It gives us a ton of 3/1 hasty, angry elementals that we can either swing with or sacrifice for value in other ways. And one way that we can get additional value out of sacrificing creatures is with a card like Fresh Meat. It says create a 3/3 green beast creature token for each creature put in your graveyard from the battlefield this turn. So basically with this, we can, sacrifice a ton of creatures, including tokens, and just keep sacrificing more and more creatures, and then we cast this and we get an absurd number of beasts. So we get all those additional death triggers that we get from our other things, and on top of that, we get an army of beasts, so we basically just kind of grew our army of tokens from 1/1s into 3/3s. But yet another card that can help us get value from sacrificing our creatures is with Whisperwood Elemental. First off, it says at the beginning of your end step, manifest a top card of your library, so that's just an easy way to get even more creatures in play. But on top of that, by sacrificing it until the end of our turn, face-up non-token creatures we control gain. When this creature dies, manifest the top card of your library. So in a roundabout way, our non-token creatures essentially replace themselves with 2/2s. And again, those are 2/2s that we can turn face up for its mana cost if it's a creature card. Now, to make sacrificing our creatures even deadlier though, we're going to be running things like Outpost Siege, Hissing Iguanar, and Rage Thrower. Outpost Siege has, when it comes to the battlefield, choose cons or dragons, and if we pick dragons, whenever a creature we control leaves the battlefield, Outpost Siege deals 1 damage to any target. This deck can sacrifice an absurd number of things in a single turn, so yeah, we can ping pretty much anything down in no time. Speaking of which, Hissing Iguanar has, whenever another creature dies, you may have Hissing Iguanar deal 1 damage to target player or planeswalker. And keep in mind with this one, it also counts our opponent's creatures as well. And then there's a bigger version of this with Rage Thrower that says whenever the creature dies, Rage Thrower deals 2 damage to target player. Again, even just 2 damage per each one of our creatures can be incredibly deadly to our opponents. And then also on the other side of the equation, we've got Warstorm Surge. It says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. Again, with all of our creatures leaving the battlefield, we've got plenty of ways to make tokens, so again, when those tokens come into play, we can start pinging things down, including our opponents. This can be especially impactful when we cast something like Fresh Meat and get a lot of 3/3s all at once to ping pretty much everything down. Regardless, there are other ways to get even more value out of sacrificing creatures. So first up, let's talk about some cards like Clone Shell, Treasure Keeper, and Gamekeeper. Clone Shell has Imprint. When it enters the battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of your library, exile one face down, then put the rest of them on your library in any order. When it dies, we turn the exile card face up. If it's a creature card, we put it onto the battlefield under our control. This deck has an absurd number of creatures, so chances are we're going to get at least one out of the top 4. And then both Treasure Keeper and Gamekeeper are essentially guaranteed to get us something when they die. Treasure Keeper says when it dies, reveal cards in the top of your library to reveal a non-land card with converted mana cost 3 or less. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. As you've already seen, we've got a ton of low to the ground cards in this deck, so chances are incredibly likely that we haven't played all of them yet. And then Gamekeeper says when it dies, you may exile it. If you do, reveal cards in the top of your library until you reveal a creature card, put that card onto the battlefield and put all other cards revealed this way into your graveyard. So Gamekeeper replaces itself with essentially the next creature up. And speaking of which, there's Miss Moon Griffin, which can get us back a creature in a different way. Its Oracle text reads, when it dies, exile it, then return the top creature card of your graveyard to the battlefield. So I know there are some players out there that like to play with their graveyard order, but just a word of caution if you're playing with this deck, don't. Regardless, Trove Warden can help us out even more. It's got landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, exile target permanent card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard. When it dies, you put each permanent card exile with it onto the battlefield under the control of that card's owner. Again, as I mentioned before, we've got a lot of cards in this deck that meet that mana cost requirement, so yeah, we can get a ton of things back with this by getting more and more lands in play and then eventually sacrificing it. And speaking of getting things back through sacrifice, there's Gerard, Weatherlight Hero. Gerard has, when it dies, exile it, then return to the battlefield or artifact and creature cards in your graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn. Basically, this is kind of like an undo button for our creatures. We just sacrifice all of our creatures, then we sacrifice Gerard, and then we get all those creatures back. Then we sacrifice those creatures again for even more value, so thank you Gerard for your sacrifice. Now, as effective as all these cards are, there's still one card in my opinion that stands above the rest. And that would be the golden pick of this deck, which is the #1 card out of 99. And the golden pick for this deck is Rally the Ancestors. Rally the Ancestors is an instant for X white white, and it says return each creature card with converted mana cost X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, exile those creatures at the beginning of the next upkeep, exile Rally the Ancestors. Again, our mana curve in this deck is extremely low. So just by putting 2 or 3 mana into the decks, we can pretty much get back all of our creatures from our graveyard. And while normally we would have to exile those creatures at the beginning of our next upkeep, again, our commander will ensure that we don't have to. So with our commander, we essentially can sacrifice our entire board for a ton of value, then cast this, get our board back, and then sacrifice them again. This can either help us rebuild in absolutely no time, or it can help us get well ahead of our opponents. And the amount of value that it can generate us is absolutely absurd, and that's why it's the golden pig. And it can especially generate us an absurd amount of value with our commander when we've got Fecundity out. Fecundity is an enchantment that says whenever a creature dies, that creature's controller may draw a card. Again, the amount of creatures that we're going to sacrifice in this deck is an absolutely incredible number, so yeah, have fun digging through your deck in no time with this. And speaking of digging through your deck, a slightly less effective version of this is Gate to the Afterlife. It says whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you gain 1 life, then you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So this looting type effect is not card advantage, but it is card selection, and that can really help us dig deep into our deck and get the right cards into our hand. And that additional life gain is not bad either. But another enchantment that can help us out in a different way is Ulvenwald Mysteries. It says whenever a non-token creature you control dies, investigate, and whenever you sacrifice a clue, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. So our non-token creatures can help us make clues, which again we can pay 2 to sacrifice to draw a card. So yeah, this can help us gain some card advantage, and again on top of that, when we do sacrifice those clues, make even more tokens. But now let's move on and talk about Season of Growth, Foster, and Ruin Grinder. Season of Growth says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. So although scrying isn't card advantage, again it is card selection, so it can help us get to the right cards in our deck. And then Foster says, whenever a creature you control dies, you may pay 1. If you do, reveal cards in the top of your library until you reveal a creature card, put that card in your hand, the rest in your graveyard. So while this isn't free value from sacrificing creatures, paying 1 mana to guarantee that we get another creature card into our hand is a really good deal. And then Ruin Grinder is a creature that can help us out as well. It has, when it dies, each player may discard their hand and draw 7 cards. So if we really need a wheel, well, we can just sacrifice this 7/4 construct with Menace. And speaking of sacrificing a creature for value, let's talk about Hoarding Dragon. It has, when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an artifact card, exile it, then shuffle your library. And then when it dies, you can put the exiled card into its owner's hand. There are plenty of fantastic artifacts in this deck, and yeah, this can basically go get us any of them. But to round out our card advantage spells, let's quickly talk about Harmonize and Escape to the Wilds. Harmonize is going to draw us 3 cards, and then Escape to the Wild says, exile the top 5 cards of your library. You may play cards exiled this way until the end of your next turn. You may play initial land this turn. So this one can ramp us, and again, this deck has a lot of low-to-the-ground cards, so we can probably make the most out of those cards that we're exiling. Regardless, now that we've talked about cards that help us with our plan, what kind of cards are we going to be utilizing to throw a wrench into our opponent's plans? First up, we've got some creatures that we can sacrifice to get rid of artifacts or enchantments with Caustic Caterpillar, Quasali Pridemage, and Thrashing Brontodon. Each of these can come in clutch in a lot of situations, and again, we've got plenty of ways to benefit from these creatures dying. And we've also got some creatures with some ETBs that can help us out with Masked Vandal and Reclamation Sage. Masked Vandal says when it enters the battlefield, you may exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, exile target artifact or enchantment opponent controls. And then Reclamation Sage says when it enters the battlefield, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment. And then if we're in desperate need, Mags of the Disc can really help us out as well. It enters the battlefield tapped, and we can pay 1 and tap it to destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. So it's kind of like a panic button on a creature. Next up, there's Slash the Ranks, which says destroy all creatures and planeswalkers except for commanders. Again, a lot of the time we're going to be completely fine if every single one of our creatures outside of our commander gets blown up. Our opponents, however, probably won't be fine with that. Or, we can just use a one-sided board wipe like Dusk. Dusk says destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater. Now, keep in mind that our commander has 3 power, but again, our commander can actually adjust its own power, so just by paying 1 mana into it, we can make our commander into a 1/1 giant, and it gets around this. And then Dawn can really help us out as well. It says return all creature cards with power 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. We have a ton of creatures that meet that requirement, so this is a fantastic card in this deck. And then next up, there's a Chroma's Vengeance, which is a flexible card that says destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments, or if we don't need to do that, we can cycle it for 3. But if we actually want to protect our army, we can do so with Rootborn Defenses and make a stand. Rootborn Defenses says populate, creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. Again, this deck has a lot of ways to make tokens, so this is pretty much always guaranteed to give us additional value with that populate. And Make a Stand says creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain indestructible until end of turn. But then we even have a creature that can help us out with Bronzehide Lion. It has, when it dies, return to the battlefield. It's an aura enchantment with enchant creature you control and pay green-white. Enchanted creature gains indestructible until end of turn and loses all other abilities. So, in a pinch, this can be a fantastic way to protect our commander. But now that we've gone through every single non-land card in this deck, let's talk about the lands. So first up, we've got Command Tower, which can tap for any of our colors, Exotic Orchard, which can tap for any of our colors most of the time, and Jungle Shrine, which can tap for any of our colors, but it does come into play tapped. Next up, we've got Ash Barrens, which has basic land cycling for 1, and then we've got Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap and sacrifice to get a basic land into play tapped. Up next, we've got some lands that can actually help ramp us with Crows and Verge, Mirrored Landscape, and Blighted Woodland. Crows and Verge is going to get us a Plains and a Forest into play tapped. Mirrored Landscape gives us any 2 basic lands that Cherry Land type into play tapped, and Blighted Woodland can get us any 2 basics into play tapped. Next up, we're going to be running all 3 of our Thriving lands with Thriving Bluff, Thriving Grove, and Thriving Heath. Each come to play tapped and tap for 1 color, and we can choose another color that they tap for. Next up, we've got lands that come to play tapped, gain us 1 life, and tap for 1 of our 2 colors with Grey Pelt Refuge, Blossoming Sands, and Windscarred Crag. And of course, we've also got Kazandu Refuge and Rugged Highlands, which are the exact same thing, but these ones tap for red or green. And then we've got an MDFC land with Anu Inversion, which is a sorcery for 6 white that's going to destroy all non-land permanents. And of course, again, because it's an MDFC land, on the backside it comes into play tapped and it taps for white. And finally, let's round out the deck with 17 basic lands, 8 of which are going to be a forest, 6 will be a plains, and 3 will be a mountain. But now that we've talked about every single card in this deck, including the lands, let's talk about the price. Again, as I mentioned at the start of this episode, every single card outside of the commander is less than $1. So this deck is incredibly budget, with the estimated cost of it being just $26.77. And keep in mind that this actually counts the cost of basic lands at 10 cents per land, so yeah, that's like, what, another $1.70 in savings? On top of that, this doesn't include heavily played or damaged cards from TCG Player. So the cost could be even less than that. Though, do keep in mind that this doesn't include shipping, which is going to vary depending on your location. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.